So in this second part of our talk, the topic is, what is the actual challenge and what are the poor practices and processes we see around data? So some examples of poor data practices that we have seen across the local government and public sector community. One of the biggest problems we tend to find is that there's a general disconnect between function and policy leads that are setting the direction and the data experts that are trying to collect data about those same things. If you think about the organizational chart within some organizations, it's often very cell-based. People are on a need-to-know basis and quite sort of siloed. Information and data generally will get passed up and down a chain of command, but very rarely will it effectively pass across cells. And if you think about a policy unit being in one area of the organization and a data unit being in the other, it's very difficult to get that flow of information between those cells. And this is something we see time and time again. Secondly, multiple versions of the same data, the truth, are often circulating both within organizations and across the data community. So this is an example about addressing data. You can see in this top left-hand picture that from the front of the property, it looks fairly straightforward. There are 6 flats in this building at this particular address on this street. However, one look at the telecom system there suggests that there are actually 7 flats in that building. And then when you actually go into the building, the picture gets even more complicated. We can see 7 flats in that building, but they're all differently named. And this, you can see why this becomes a problem within data organizations, because quite often people will not be using standardized addresses. They'll just rely on free text boxes to capture addresses. So whenever you want to do any comparables of addresses, there's often a massive disconnect between the data. We also see this at a more wider level. These are 2 data sets collecting information about the exact same things. However, they differ, and there are different methodologies for capturing the data. One of them is open, one of them is not open. So we need to get to a better place where everyone is sure what their role is and why they're doing these things. Data and information is often only published in tables within Word documents and PDF documents. An example of this was the recent election in 2019. This is a slide is showing a link to a PDF document about places where people can go and vote. So if you open it up, it looks fair enough. There's an address in there. It doesn't have a postcode, and it has a code number. But if I want to use that as a data person, it's in a PDF document. I can't do anything with that at all. When you do a bit more digging, it turns out that another team within this organization actually has a spreadsheet of these very same locations with totally different addresses, far more accurate, and importantly, the unique property reference numbers of the places where people can go and vote. And because it has that code, that UPRN, it then means we can join it to a coordinate and put it on a map. And this is far more intelligible and far more useful. But what it means is there's two versions of the truth in circulation. Not providing mandatory and statutory data returns. So the local authorities are responsible for creating addresses and street naming and numbering. It's the statutory part of the planning process and building standards application processes. There are 2 standardized databases that local authorities create. The local street gazetteer and the Corporate Address Gazetteer, and they are joined together to make the Local Land and Property Gazetteer. These are also provided to the Improvement Service to join the One Scotland Gazetteer, and they're then forwarded on to the Organ Service address-based product. As part of this whole initiative, local authorities are responsible for uploading data frequently so that we have an up-to-date national data set. However, you can see from this slide that many local authorities either haven't provided a satisfactory return or are not providing frequent enough returns into the national database. This is a problem because the whole data community relies on an up-to-date address data set, and if we're not putting that out, then it has implications, and it's actually possible that organisations can be fined if they don't provide this data in a timely manner. Poor and inaccurate data collection. One of the things we see time and time again is people using Excel to create data without realizing that the things they do with it can actually hinder the use that can be made of the data. So this is just a quick example. People inserting rows within data that are for humans to read, but actually make it incredibly difficult for machines to make sense of it. Also inserting things like foreign characters in headers. These are massive no-nos in the data community. But very people that use Excel spreadsheets appreciate the issues that this can cause, and this impacts the productivity issue that I was talking about in previous talk. Another example of poor data practices is when we inaccurately record things. On the screen here, we show 3 roads leading into the same settlement. However, when you look at the details behind these roads within the data, they register against 3 separate settlements. The property circled there actually had fire one evening, and it turns out that there was confusion about where to send a fire engine from. And lo and behold, the place furthest away was chosen to send the fire engine from. And obviously this has real implications in our lives from a health and safety perspective. So data becomes more and more important the more it gets used like this. Another example of poor data practices is poor accuracy or poor precision. So these 2 diagrams show what we mean by accuracy and precision. You can see that good accuracy means that everything is recorded well and in the same way, equaling good precision as well. But when we have poor accuracy, we might have precise values being collected, all which are roughly similar, but they don't mirror what the true values should be. We also see poor resourcing for crucial data roles across local government and the public sector. And particularly, we see this with gazetteer staff within some organisations and data managers. This is to be expected because we see a massive funding crisis looming, certainly within local government. At the rate that our population is increasing, we are going to be suffering a massive impact in our finances, and it's to be expected that roles like data managers and data experts, if we don't value them and treat them importantly with organizations, we're going to see people keep leaving, and therefore the data is going to keep decreasing and making it ever more difficult to make informed decisions. Another problem we see is the lack of standards that are used, both in sharing data and making data interoperable and useful. And we've seen this just lately with the coronavirus crisis within the country. Certainly, the sharing of data between the NHS and local authorities has suffered from the lack of standards being captured within the data and the lack of knowledge about why people are sharing data and for what purposes. And one of the biggest issues that we find, but also one of the biggest opportunities we found around the coronavirus, is using things like standard identifiers, like unique property reference numbers, for every address in the country, which makes it far easier to join details together to get a full picture of what's going on with the emergency and crisis. But there are also things out there that can help us with this. There are a multitude of standards that are openly published by people like the Open Data Institute, that if we only knew about them, they'd make our jobs far more easier and increase our productivity markedly. So if we think about the particular challenges that we should set anyone responsible for data, the first question is, how does anyone know that your data actually exists and what it represents? And this can be quite easily remedied through the use of metadata registers and catalogs. And there are standards around all of this stuff. We also need to ask the question about what could you do to discover what other data exists in your organization? Because many organizations simply haven't got a clue what they're already collecting. And we advise that a simple data audit is a very effective way of doing this. But importantly, a data audit shouldn't just sit somewhere that isn't accessible. It should be published either for the internal organization or more widely so everyone else knows what data is being collected. How can we assess what skills we have within our organizations for creating, managing, and analyzing data? Well, a simple data skills audit can give us this information, and it gives us far more power to understand what we are as an organization and how we can flex to make better use of data within our organization. How can our data be accessed and shared better? Well, there are many shared platforms that we can use for better sharing. There are things like web services and APIs where we can use the internet for data sharing, but also there's a piece about licensing there and using licenses to better share data between organizations. How can your data be linked to any other data set to answer questions and look at hypotheses? Well, this is the point about interoperability and unique identifiers and standards and lookups. If everyone starts capturing data and referencing data in exactly the same ways, it makes it far easier for us to join it all together to make decisions. And where can you go for those standards and guidance that I was talking about in the previous slide? Well, there's a whole group of organizations that are working on standards that can be approached depending on the context and the purpose of the data that's being collected.